Watch this clip of Donald Trump interacting with Terry Moran of ABC News during an interview that aired to mark Donald Trump's first 100 days in office. This is an exchange they had over a picture of Kilmar Abrego Garcia's knuckles. You, of course, remember Kilmar Abrego Garcia is the Salvadoran man who Donald Trump deported as one of these DOJ attorneys actually admitted at the time in error. The Trump administration has since contended that it was an error because of the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act. Obviously, everyone remembers Chris Van Hollen, senator from Maryland, going to get Kilmar Abrego Garcia or attempting to get him back from El Salvador, going down to El Salvador. Trump ally Bukele, Nayib Bukele, has said he is not going to release Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to the United States. So that's the conversation that Terry Moran broached with Donald Trump in this interview when the pair of them started to discuss Kilmar Abrego Garcia's knuckles. And after you watch the clip, we'll get into all of the details because right now the administration is on the cusp of facing more and more heat for a lack of deportation from MAGA allies. And that's why this is worth getting into. So take a look.
He wasn't a member of a gang. And then they looked, and on his knuckles, he had MS-13.
There's a dispute over that.
Wait a minute. He had MS-13 on his knuckles tattooed.
He had some tattoos that are interpreted that way. But let's move on.
Wait a minute. Hey, Terry.
He did not have the letter MS-13.
It says MS-13.
That was Photoshopped. So let me
That was Photoshopped. Terry, you can't do that. Hey, they're giving you the big break of a lifetime. You know, you're doing the interview. I picked you because, frankly, I never heard of you, but that's okay. But I picked you, Terry. But you're not being very nice. He had MS-13 tattooed.
We'll agree to disagree. I want to move on to something else.
Terry, do you want me to show you the picture?
I saw the picture.
And you think it was Photoshop? Well,
here we go.
Don't Photoshop it. Go look at his hand. He had MS-13.
He did have tattoos that can be interpreted that way. I'm not an expert on them. I want to turn to Ukraine, sir.
Terry,
I want to get to Ukraine.
No. He had MS as clear as you can be, not interpreted. This is why people no longer believe the news, because
when
it's
he was photographed
news.
in El Salvador, they aren't there. But let's just go on. They aren't there when he's in El Salvador.
They weren't
Take a look
there,
at the
but
photograph.
they're there now, right?
No,
but they're there
in
now.
your picture.
Terry.
Ukraine, sir.
He's got MS-13 on his knuckles.
All right.
Okay?
Well, we'll take a look at that.
You do such a disservice.
We'll take a look at that,
Why don't you
sir.
just say, yes, he does, and, go on to something else?
It's contested.
Now let's look at the actual picture of Kilmar Abrego Garcia's knuckles that Donald Trump is referencing. So what you see on the image is a tattoo on several knuckles, right? 4 knuckles. And if you're listening to this, it's easy enough to describe what's in the picture. What Trump seems to be referencing here is the, quote, MS-13 that his White House added to the image. You can call it Photoshop or an edit, whatever it is. What they did was put above the pictures MS-13. Like they added those letters in a way that is very obviously not original to his hand. Doesn't look anything like the tattoo. And what you see, or the tattoos, what you see is a marijuana leaf, a smiley face with 2 X's where the eyes should be, a cross, and then a skull. So I'm not ready to just completely dismiss what's on Kilmar Abrego Garcia's hand as, totally innocent, has absolutely nothing to do with gangs. Now, if it was MS-13, experts say MS-13, you have to have MS-13 tattooed on your body. This, some people have said, because it's marijuana leaf, smiley, cross, and skull. You can, marijuana, M, smiley, S, cross sort of looks like a 1. I don't know what you do with the skull, but some people have tried to say that's what this is. But Donald Trump, this is where it's interesting, seems to have been duped by his own White House's Photoshop, right? You see him in that interview genuinely saying, Terry, he had MS-13 tattooed on his knuckles. Maybe you can say Donald Trump is lying, but he offered to show Terry Moran the picture. And the picture makes it very clear that these are like serif font from a computer just pasted onto the knuckles. I mean, if you're watching this, it's so obvious. You can see the picture of Donald Trump holding up that picture. And, at risk of sounding sort of crass, The only way that you can really explain this is it's Donald Trump being kind of an internet boomer. And I think he might actually even be a little too old to be in the boomer demographic, but to use like crude, casual online terms and not knowing that this is very clearly letters from a computer or a software program that you're very easily able to just drop onto the knuckles. And what's important about that, or a couple things that are important about that, but what I think is particularly important about that is Donald Trump seems to believe that Kilmar Abrego Garcia, the centerpiece of the debate about Donald Trump's deportation policy, which is in and of itself the second prong in a two-pronged immigration strategy. First, stop border crossings. He has absolutely done that. Many mainstream media outlets have actually given him credit for doing that in their 100-day sort of commemoration pieces or reflection pieces. So he's done that. But the second part of it is, quote, mass deportations. And Kilmar Abrego Garcia has been the most high-profile deportation case. Donald Trump seems to believe that the media, some other Republicans, including people like Andy McCarthy and other legal folks, Ed Whalen, are looking at this case of a man who is completely confirmed MS-13 because it's literally written on his hand, and taking issue with Donald Trump's deportation process. Well, recession concerns are making headlines again, and experts, of course, are paying attention. Jim Walker, the economist who predicted the 2008 market crash, recently said he'd be amazed if a recession can be avoided. For those in or nearing retirement, this economic uncertainty is a real concern, very real. When the dollar declines and markets become volatile, traditional retirement strategies can be exposed, unfortunately. That's why more people are exploring gold IRAs. It's a way to include physical gold in your retirement portfolio. Historically, gold has maintained its value during recessions and periods of inflation, offering a potential hedge against economic downturns. This video is proudly sponsored by Augusta Precious Metals, who've put together a free gold IRA guide to help you understand how it works, why it matters, and whether it's the right fit for you and your financial goals. Gold IRAs are specifically for funds that are already held in a qualified retirement account like an IRA or a 401k. Big thanks to Augusta Precious Metals for supporting this video and for making this resource available for free. If gold is piquing your interest, you can download your free guide by clicking the link below. Now, to be clear, if Kilmar Abrego Garcia had MS-13 tattooed onto his knuckles brazenly for the entire world to see, this entire process wouldn't have unfolded as it did unfold, because you would obviously not have had to be going back and forth with judges as to whether he belonged to MS-13 in the same way, because the evidence would be so much clearer. They wouldn't have had to rely on a confidential informant. To be clear, I'm not completely dismissing the evidence from the confidential informant who did tell law enforcement that Abrego Garcia was a known member of MS-13. Now, some people have said, on the left especially, because that confidential informant said that Garcia was part of a branch that was mostly based in New York, that it was unreliable testimony, but it is true. And we went through in an episode 2 weeks ago all of the evidence involving Kilmar Abrego Garcia, and it's not completely clear in either direction that he is MS-13 or that he's not MS-13. But what is clear is that when the Trump administration deported Kilmar Abrego Garcia in the group of mostly Venezuelans who were flown to CCOT, the Terrorism Confinement Center in El Salvador. This is Nayib Bukele's very high-profile, flashy prison, very, very high-security prison that human rights groups have taken issue with, and that he, by his own admission, is very clear about being a very tough place for prisoners. When Abrego Garcia was part of that group of mostly Venezuelans who were sent to El Salvador, he had what's called a withholding order by a judge who said he had a credible reason for not being deported to El Salvador. So he was fully deportable. He could have been deported at any moment. That would have been perfectly legal. The question is whether he was deportable to El Salvador. And this gets into whether or not it was okay because Donald Trump had invoked the Alien Enemies Act against MS-13, that the United States had been invaded. And we could get into all of that. It's relevant, but it's a very niche legal debate about whether the Alien Enemies Act allows the Trump administration to override this very particular withholding order and deport someone who was fully deportable back to this very specific country. Again, that is a niche legal debate, but what we do know is that a lawyer at the Department of Justice, so Trump's Department of Justice, said that it was an error. The administration later parted ways with that attorney, but what we do know is that at least an attorney and many legal experts who have weighed in on this have said that was an error. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, fully, you can deport him. You just can't deport him back to El Salvador because of this, unless you go back through the process and prove that his claim to being afraid of Barrio 18, another gang in El Salvador, is nonsense. And by the way, there's probably a good case to be made that his claim of being afraid of going back to El Salvador would have holes poked in it by the government at this point, by the federal government at this point, and that they probably could have, if they had gone through the process, taken Kilmar Abrego Garcia back to El Salvador, ultimately, if they had fought that. There's probably a good case to be made that that is true. But what's very interesting now is that Donald Trump thinks Chris Van Hollen, who are the others that have gone down? Maxwell Frost. We've seen Democrats flock down to El Salvador. We've seen many Democrats express solidarity with Kilmar Abrego Garcia, which, by the way, I disagree with my friends on the left. I think is an absolute public relations mistake, because I think to most Americans who have heard allegations, by the way, from his wife, who is very defensive of him now, but did at one point say that he had abused her. She has walked that back, but has accused him of abuse, or really serious charges of abuse against him. She claims now that she's walked those back, but at one point actually went to court on those to get, I believe it was a temporary restraining order against him. So I think to most Americans, he looks like a very unsympathetic case. I also think to most Americans, they say, even the most unsympathetic cases, you can't just be throwing people in Salvadoran prisons. I think it matters to most Americans that the Trump administration is taking somebody who's not supposed to be back in El Salvador and insisting that now that he's there, there's nothing they can do to get him back. Donald Trump, in his interview with Terry Moran, actually did concede that point, which is something that Bukele and others in the Trump administration had been playing really coy with before, saying, well, we can't bring the guy back. Trump told Terry Moran, yeah, basically it would take me one call to get him back. But I think to most Americans, it looks like, okay, Democrats, you just spent the last 4 years, as the New York Times has reported, putting at least 8 million, an 8 million net number of new migrants into this country. And you are flying down to El Salvador for this one case, this one man of somebody who may or may not be MS-13, who does seem like there's a potential that he really is an MS-13, who was in the country illegally, who has these accusations against him. He was pulled over in the car of a man who actually was accused of human trafficking while he was driving in Tennessee. We could get into that story. But he's been accused of hurting his wife. And now, actually, this is a news story from Jenny Terr at the New York Post. She's reported, literally just this week, that court documents from 2018, so this is before Kilmar Abrego Garcia claimed asylum in 2019, when he was about to be deported, he, with his lawyers, decided to make an asylum claim. This is his wife's ex-boyfriend, filed a petition in Prince George's County Circuit Court seeking an emergency hearing on the custody of the couple's 2 children. She is dating a gang member. That is what you can see it here in his own handwriting. The ex-boyfriend of Abrego Garcia's wife, said in an affidavit in PG County Court here in the DC area back in 2018. So now we have something else in an affidavit, meaning that somebody who was running in circles obviously has the incentive here if he wants the custody of the children. So it's not as though there would be no motivations to potentially fabricate a charge of gang membership on behalf of Edwin Ramos in this case. But the petition, let's also say, this is in Jenny's report, it doesn't identify who Garcia is by name, and the judge denied this emergency hearing, this request for emergency hearing, later dismissed the petition in early 2019 over jurisdictional issues, and it fizzles from there. But it's also, again, clear that this is Abrego Garcia based on the timeline of his relationship with Vasquez Sura, that we know from social media and others. So they moved in together in 2018. In 2019, they got married. They met in 2016, according to a report in NBC News. And so these are the pieces of the puzzle that Jenny Terre puts together in the New York Post. So it's pretty clear that this is referring to Abrego Garcia, and that's another important piece of evidence. But it's also remarkable that the President of the United States thinks all of this uproar from Democrats is over somebody who literally had MS-13 tattooed on their knuckles. And I imagine it's, not easy for any commander-in-chief, leader of the free world, to pay attention to the granular details of this insanely convoluted legal battle over Kilmar Abrego Garcia. So you, in some case, probably just get the 30,000-foot view story. And Donald Trump thinks that the 30,000-foot view story here is that Kilmar Abrego Garcia literally has MS-13 tattooed onto his knuckles, and his deportation is being blocked by Democrats who are literally flying down to El Salvador. That is a actually pretty interesting and important misunderstanding of the facts in this case. And it's not to say, again, Kilmar Abrego Garcia is wholly innocent of the claims that he's in MS-13. Again, you have a confidential informant telling law enforcement that. 2 judges found that it was credible that he was a member of MS-13. It's not nothing at all. And I think that's partially why Democrats made a big error in this case. But my goodness, it's a big difference between whether or not the legal system is treating him fairly if he literally has MS-13 tattooed onto him. And so this brings us to an increasing problem for Donald Trump as he looks at the next 100 days of his administration. People on the right are starting to get, and this is, I'm talking about like the hardcore MAGA camp, are starting to get nervous that the level of deportations he's been able to oversee over the course of the first 100 days, that pace mathematically doesn't add up to their interpretation of the phrase mass deportations over the course of a 4-year Trump presidency. And you can look at the Abrego Garcia case and say, well, this is why. This is a pretty obvious reason why Donald Trump hasn't been able to keep up these rates, because he's being thwarted even when people who have been found twice in court to be gang members aren't actually, you can't deport them without having a complete media circus. And, that's there's something to that, right? Like, it does mean that this is going to have to go through a very convoluted immigration court system. We had Glenn Greenwald on last week to talk about this. Glenn has made the point that actually to hear immigration cases, yes, it does mean you have to go to immigration judges, but it's not like the longest process in the world. And so if the Trump administration didn't rely on Alien Enemy Act powers to hold some of these hearings and just focused on beefing up logistically the process, it's still going to be really hard. I mean, there's no question about it. There are going to be a million sob stories, and the administration actually is going to make mistakes. My take would be the administration should own up to mistakes that it makes, not inflame and give fodder, give ammunition to its opponents, Democrats, mass migration Republicans, and the media, by doubling, tripling down on legitimate mistakes. I think in this case, that's just my take. You can read Andy McCarthy. I've read a lot of Andy McCarthy. I know a lot of pro-Trump conservatives don't like Andy McCarthy, but I tend to find his legal analyses very helpful. So you can read that. You can read Ed Whalen. You can read others who have kind of parsed the legality of this, the constitutionality of this. And I agree with them. I think this was a mistake. I don't think it's covered by Alien Enemies Act invocation in this case. And I think that actually makes it a pretty simple situation for the Trump administration to just come back, hear the case, bring the guy back, keep him in detainment, hear the case, and then send him either to another country that you're able to arrange deportation to. That is one of the hard parts of this process, by the way, is that a lot of the migrants who came in under Joe Biden are Cubans and Venezuelans. And Cubans and Venezuelans, you're going to have a hard time deporting back in mass numbers that they came in during the Trump administration, because those are countries that are not going to cooperate with mass deportations unless you're able to deal with them in ways we haven't seen this administration really try yet. So that's a legitimate obstacle, and that's something where Donald Trump can blame Joe Biden. Over and over again in these cases, you can blame Joe Biden, but at a certain point, it may be Joe Biden's fault that deportations are hard. Being difficult doesn't mean Donald Trump is going. The fact that Biden made this work extremely difficult by allowing so many people to claim asylum. Democrats are making this very difficult by maintaining sanctuary city policies. This stuff is being hampered in ways that I think are very objectionable by the left, because we had an influx of, again, the net estimate from the New York Times, 8 million. That's the population of several mid-sized states put together. 8 million people over the course of a 4-year term from Joe Biden. A lot of that actually happened in like 3 years, 3.5 years. So when you have numbers like that, yes, it's going to be difficult. You will make mistakes, and the media is going to make the most out of every single one of them. But all that is to say, there's a lot more that the Trump administration could be doing to beef up the existing system. They are trying to fund ICE, Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, at a higher level in Donald Trump's big, beautiful reconciliation bill, as he calls it, that congressional Republicans are working on right now. But it's also not helpful to double, triple down on examples where that went down. I think that hampers, or when things went incorrectly, when there were actual mistakes, I think that hampers the administration's ability to just say, yeah, we made mistakes and we are going to make mistakes and we'll deal with them responsibly, constitutionally. And even if, these people are unsympathetic, we're going to hear their cases out, and then they're going to get out of the country, because we're going to do it with people who don't belong here. We're going to get through the quote-unquote worst of the worst, which is what they've said to do first. Now, there are a lot of bad people who have been let into the country. If you look at annual numbers of people with criminal backgrounds who are caught by the government, who are in the country illegally, it's stunning numbers in recent years. You can look that up on the DHS website. But so there are a lot of people. But to meet that sort of mass deportations level, you're then going to have to go on to people who have created lives in this country that make them more sympathetic characters to the media, and that, when you hear this story, you do genuinely feel for them. And that's one of the things that I took back from going to northern Mexico a few years ago in cartel country, talking to people who were waiting to cross the border. They were trying to get asylum hearings, or some of them were just waiting for Title 42 policies to shift. And during the early days of the Biden administration, and it made me even more mad at Joe Biden at that time. It just made me furious, because what we were seeing was a virtue signal, essentially, from Democrats who were too afraid to implement tough immigration policies during COVID. They were too afraid. And so they were using, they were virtue signaling in ways that made people flood up to the border. And because they lacked the political courage to take tough steps then, they were so caught up in doing this anti-Trump flex and this anti-Trump signaling that what it signaled to people, millions and millions of people in South and Central America, some of whom are in dire circumstances in Venezuela and Cuba, what it signaled is, come on up. we will probably be very lenient. As long as you cross the border and get an asylum hearing, you'll be let into the country. Once you're let into the country, we have these things called sanctuary cities where you can disappear into the shadows. And because even that precarious existence to people who are coming from places like Venezuela, even as precarious as that is, it is still better to them than Venezuela. In some cases, it's better to them than living, as many Haitians did in Argentina and Brazil and Chile. I've talked about this many times for the years since I started covering this more closely, but it just makes you mad because people are making rational decisions to come to the United States and go through a process that Joe Biden legalized, which is we will allow for mass asylum claims, and you will be within your legal rights to claim asylum and stay in the country. You won't have to remain in Mexico, as Donald Trump said you would. You won't have to remain in detainment, as our law says you should. We're changing that. So it's now legal for you to come into America, claim asylum, and then go disappear into a sanctuary city. And it's a rational choice for people who live in Venezuela or Cuba to make that decision and say, I'm following the process in America legally. They allow me to do this, and it's better for me and my children. I don't think it's necessarily right, but I don't think it's irrational. And that is the fault of the Biden administration and Democrats who created a permission structure that was rational for people to do that. So I'm entirely empathetic with people, Republicans and some of those Democrats who latched onto the Laken Riley bill, which I also think was an imperfect bill, but I'm sympathetic to people who want to deal with the problem of so many people living precariously in the United States because they have murky legal status. They have to live very carefully in the shadows in order to avoid potential deportation, which they don't want. And so, like Abrego Garcia, they have things like expired licenses. When he was pulled over in Tennessee, he was driving on an expired license, and he was driving erratically. If I were a person in Tennessee, I would be pretty damn upset that somebody who is not a legal resident, or that is to say, who's not a U.S. citizen, is driving erratically on my highways, putting my life in danger, and doesn't have a driver's license, and then is able to keep staying in the country. That kind of stuff would absolutely make me furious, even if he has a wife and child. These are sad stories because people have been allowed to live these precarious existences in our country over the last, half decade. Especially though over the course of the Biden administration. And these are tough cases that need to be dealt with. The wrong way to do it is to either, if you're somebody who gave Donald Trump this picture and said, it's real that it's MS-13, if he was misled by his own staff, or if you're Donald Trump, to not have the exact facts of the case in front of you. I know we've talked about this case a lot, but it's important to people around the country who voted for Donald Trump on a ticket of mass deportations, whose communities have been upended, like a Springfield, Ohio, by Biden-era migration, and who care about this. To know whether or not the administration is approaching the issue in a way that is efficacious, in a way that will actually help this policy that people voted Donald Trump to see enacted. And it's a complicated case. It's a dramatic case, so there are a lot of incentives to focus on it. I think to some extent, the problem with this case being interesting is that it's become a massive distraction for the administration, who has some people who are genuinely trying to do the best they can to get the country back to a state that makes sense. But seriously, these stories, some of them, again, rational, many of them very sympathetic, and very hard to actually take the medicine of deporting people who love the United States, who came here because they love the United States and the opportunity that it represents. And you may think that makes me sound soft if you're one of my fellow conservatives, but it's true. A lot of people come to the U.S. because they love the U.S. They believe in the American dream, but they haven't gone through processes that make sense for U.S. citizens, and that's what people voted against, that Democrats had implemented. That's what people voted against. And, there's plenty of, unfortunately, there are plenty of people who, like Kilmar Abrego Garcia's experience documents, they end up living lives of great personal drama, and children have the stress of people pinging through the legal system. They avoid reporting things like domestic violence. Spouses avoid reporting things like domestic violence because maybe a child is then affected by a deportation. They, go through other ways to try to circumvent law enforcement because they don't want to be deported even for mundane things like, again, expired licenses or marijuana, or whatever it is. But it's seen as grossly unfair to American citizens, many American citizens who voted for Donald Trump. The country is still very divided, don't get me wrong. But I think the Trump administration, in its first 100 days, it's about to get a lot more heat in the second 100 days on the pace of deportations. And I don't think that is entirely the fault of the left. And so that's what I wanted to talk about based on this clip of Terry Moran and Donald Trump going back and forth. To me, it just represents a serious flaw in the administration's approach to this, that the President of the United States seems to have a fundamentally incorrect fact about the most high-profile deportation case right now. Last thing to mention is CNN had a report similar to reporting that DropSite has done recently on a deal that the Trump administration has struck with the Bukele administration, that Bukele gets millions of dollars from the U.S., about $20,000 according to CNN per deportee that is held in Salvadoran detention. So about $20,000. And on top of that, it's in exchange for the U.S. deporting MS-13 members who have wreaked havoc in our country back to El Salvador. Now, DropSite's reporting suggests that's because Bukele wants to keep out of the court system his cooperation with those gangs to bring down gang violence in El Salvador, which absolutely has plummeted, no question about it. But he wants to keep any potential deals, the reporting suggests, any potential deals that he struck with these gangs to bring violence down in his country out of any cooperation with those gangs, any collusion with those gangs, out of the court system in the U.S. And that's where these very high-level MS-13 deportations have happened. This is DropSite and CNN have now reported on these deals, so that's another thing to keep in mind that may be scrutinized in the next 100 days. So thank you for tuning in. I'm going to continue to follow this case because I do think it's important at shining light on big mistakes Democrats are making and mistakes that Republicans are making, and one of the most important issues to American voters. You can subscribe for a premium version of the show over at undercurrents.tv. You get an email address, private email address to talk to us, ask us questions. You get private episodes, paywalled episodes just for subscribers, and a weekly email from me. Also, make sure to subscribe on YouTube, wherever you download your podcasts, and we will be back here with more soon.